The door didn't slam. That was the worst part. She closed it softly, like I wasn't worth the anger. I was 63 years old, standing in the hallway of the house I'd built with my own hands. Literally, I'd laid the hardwood floors myself the summer my son turned 12, and my daughter-in-law had just looked me in the eye and said, "You're not part of this family anymore. You're a guest, and guests don't get opinions." Then she closed the door, softly. "My name is Frank. I'm 67 now. I'm telling this story because I think there are a lot of people out there who know exactly what that hallway felt like. Who know what it means to watch someone you love choose silence over you, over and over, until the silence becomes the loudest thing in the room. I want to tell you what happened, all of it, and I want to tell you what I did about it. My son Marcus was 31 when he married Claudine. I liked her at first. That's the honest truth. I'm not going to pretend I saw it coming, because I didn't. She was sharp, well-spoken, worked in marketing for a firm in downtown Toronto. She had this way of laughing at your jokes slightly after everyone else, like she'd decided to approve of them. I should have paid more attention to that. His mother, my wife Helen, had passed 4 years before the wedding. Ovarian cancer. 18 months from diagnosis to gone. I won't talk too much about that because it still catches me sideways sometimes, even now. What I'll say is that after Helen died, Marcus and I became very close. He'd come over to the house in Oakville most Sundays. We'd watch the Leafs lose, which they do reliably, and I'd make her beef stew recipe because it was something to do with my hands while we talked. Those Sundays kept me alive, if I'm being honest. Then Claudine came into the picture. I tried. I want to be clear about that. I drove to Costco and bought the good coffee because she mentioned once she didn't like my instant. I stopped talking about Helen as much around her, even though every room in that house still had Helen in it. I didn't say anything when Marcus started canceling Sundays, first once a month, then twice, then they just stopped being a thing we did. What I told myself was, he's building a life. That's good. That's what you want for your kid. What I didn't understand yet was that building a life, in Claudine's version, meant taking a wrecking ball to the old one. It started with the money. I'd been retired for 2 years by then, living off my pension from 40 years at Ontario Hydro and some investments I'd been careful with. I owned the Oakville house outright. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable, which in my generation meant you'd done something right. Marcus called one evening and said they were having trouble with the mortgage on their condo in Mississauga. Could I help, just for a few months, while Claudine transitioned to a new job? Of course I said yes. That's what fathers do. I transferred $14,000 to his account. A few months later, it was the car. Claudine's lease was up, and they needed a down payment, another $8,000. Then it was a business opportunity. Claudine had an idea for a consulting side project, and they needed a small investment to get it started. I asked questions this time, not many, but enough that Marcus got quiet on the phone and said, "Dad, I thought you trusted me." That sentence, I've thought about it 100 times since, how it was engineered to make my reasonable caution into a personal failing. I gave them $10,000. By the time I added it up, which I did one night sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of rye and a yellow notepad, very Canadian of me, I had given my son and his wife over $40,000 in 18 months. I had nothing in writing. There had been no conversation about repayment. There had not actually been much conversation at all. What there had been was one phone call from Claudine directly, where she'd mentioned almost in passing that the house in Oakville was sitting empty most of the time, and that it must be a lot to maintain for just one person. I didn't say anything then, but I heard it. My grandson Eli was born that spring. He was the best thing. I want to make sure I say that clearly. Eli was a completely unearned gift, and I loved him without condition from the first time Marcus put him in my arms in the delivery room at Credit Valley Hospital. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, this tiny, furious person who smelled like something new. I thought Eli would fix things. I thought stupidly, hopefully, that a baby would remind everyone what family was actually for. Instead, Claudine began managing my access to him like a resource. I'd call to ask about coming for a visit, and she'd say they were busy. I'd offer to babysit, and she'd say they had it covered. Once I drove to Mississauga on a Sunday. I should have called first. I know that, and when I knocked on the door, Claudine answered and looked at me the way you'd look at a door-to-door salesman you recognized from last time. "Marcus isn't home," she said. "That's all right," I said. "I thought I'd see Eli." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said Eli was sleeping and closed the door. I sat in my car in their visitor parking for about 10 minutes before I drove home. I didn't tell Marcus. I don't know why. Maybe I thought he'd choose her side and I wasn't ready to know that yet. The night she said what she said to me in the hallway, the guest comment, the door closing softly, was a Thursday in November. I'd driven up because Marcus had left a message saying I should come for dinner, that they wanted to talk about something important. I remember I brought a bottle of Ontario Red and a bag of those Montreal-style bagels from the bakery in Port Credit that Claudine had once said she liked. The bagels were still on the counter when she told me I wasn't part of the family. The important thing they'd wanted to discuss, it turned out, was the house, my house. Claudine had done some research. She used that word, research, the way someone uses it when they want you to know they've been thinking about you without your knowledge. And she believed that if I signed the property over to them now as a living transfer, everyone would avoid probate fees when the time came. She had numbers. She had printed out a document. "It makes sense," Marcus said. He wasn't looking at me. "You'd still live there," Claudine said. "Nothing would change." I asked to look at the document. She slid it across the table like we were closing a deal. I read it slowly. I'm not a lawyer, but I was a project manager for 30 years. I know how to read a contract. What it said, boiled down, was that I would transfer ownership of my home to Marcus and Claudine jointly, immediately, in exchange for a right to occupy clause that gave me residency at the discretion of the property owners. At their discretion. I put the document down. I said I needed to think about it, and that's when Claudine said what she said. Not in those exact words, not right away. There was a conversation first, or what she would call a conversation, where she explained that my hesitation was hurtful, that after everything they'd done to include me in their lives, this was a small thing to ask, that she had made Marcus feel like he had to choose, and had I considered how unfair that was to him? I said, "I've given you over $40,000 in the past 2 years. The room went very quiet. Then she stood up and said what she said and closed the door, and I stood in the hallway with the bottle of Ontario Red still in my hand. Marcus did not come out of the room. I left the bagels on the counter and I drove home. I want to tell you what that drive home was like, because I think it matters. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't. I just drove down the QEW with the radio off and thought about Helen. I thought about how she used to say that the only thing worse than being wronged is letting it make you small. She was not a woman who let things make her small. Even at the end, even when she had every reason to shrink, she didn't. I thought about Eli, his 7 pounds, 4 ounces, the way he'd grab my finger in the hospital like he already knew me. And I thought about the $40,000 and the document with the discretion clause and the way Marcus hadn't looked at me across the table. I decided something on that drive. I decided I was not going to get angry. I was not going to call and shout or send a letter or involve anyone in a drama. I was going to be very, very patient and very, very patient, and I was going to wait for the right moment. I had some time, and I had some things Claudine didn't know I had. The first call I made the next morning was to my financial advisor, a woman named Beverly who had been managing my accounts since Marcus was in high school. I explained the situation. I asked her to walk me through my complete financial picture and to flag anything that might be vulnerable. The second call was to a lawyer, not a family lawyer, a real estate and estate lawyer, a man I found through the Law Society of Ontario referral service. I drove to his office in Burlington with the document Claudine had given me and the yellow notepad with my $40,000 calculations on it. He read the document. He looked up at me over his glasses. "You didn't sign this?" he said. "No," I said. "Good," he said. He explained several things to me that I hadn't known, that the transfers I'd made to Marcus, because they were undocumented and made under what could be argued as undue influence, might be claimable as loans in a civil matter. That the right to occupy at discretion clause was, in his words, aggressively one-sided. That I should immediately update my will and ensure my estate was structured in a way that couldn't be accessed or anticipated before my death. I spent 3 weeks doing exactly that. I updated my will. I structured a testamentary trust for Eli, money that would go to him directly at 25, managed by Beverly, bypassing his parents entirely. I documented as best I could remember, and with whatever records I had, every transfer I'd made to Marcus and Claudine. I wrote a statutory declaration, signed in front of a commissioner, stating that these amounts had been given under the expectation of a close family relationship that I now believed had been deliberately cultivated for financial gain. I didn't tell Marcus any of this. What I did do was call him, calmly. I said I'd had time to think, and I wasn't ready to make any decisions about the house, and I hoped we could keep talking. He seemed relieved. He apologized. In that way, people apologize when they're sorry you're upset rather than sorry for what they did. Claudine, he said, was under a lot of stress. I said I understood. I did not understand, but I said I did. The invitation came in February. Claudine's parents were visiting from Vancouver. Her father was a semi-retired contractor. Her mother did something with event planning, and she was organizing a family dinner at a restaurant in Oakville, somewhere on Lakeshore. She sent a text to Marcus's phone, which he forwarded to me, and there was a line at the end that said, "Tell your dad he should come. It would be nice to all be together." I knew what this was. This was the closing scene she'd imagined. Me at the table, surrounded by her family and mine, with the documents still on the table between us and everyone watching to see what I'd do. Claudine was good at staging things. I'd noticed that about her. I wrote back that I'd love to come. I made 2 phone calls after that. The first was to my lawyer. I told him about the dinner and what I was thinking. He listened. He said it was legal. It was my choice, and to document everything afterward. The second call was to a man named Phil, who I'd worked with at Ontario Hydro for 22 years. Phil had retired before me and now did a little consulting, but what he'd done for most of his career was financial investigations. Finding money that had moved where it shouldn't have, tracing patterns in accounts, building the kind of quiet paper trail that organizations use when they needed to have a very specific kind of conversation with someone. I explained the $40,000. I explained the document. I explained the consulting business that had never, to my knowledge, produced any consulting. Phil said he'd need a couple of weeks. What he found, I want to be careful about how I say this. I'm not going to tell you it was criminal, because my lawyer told me not to use that word without a proper adjudication. What I'll say is that Phil identified a pattern of transfers and corporate registrations that told an interesting story about where the $10,000 I'd given for Claudine's consulting business had gone, and about a numbered company registered in Alberta that Marcus hadn't mentioned to me. and about the fact that Claudine's new job she'd been transitioning to 18 months ago appeared, from public records, never to have materialized. Phil put it in a summary document, 4 pages, clear, referenced. I printed 2 copies. I put them in a folder. The night before the dinner, I also called my younger brother Calvin, who is 60 and still thinks he's 45 and drives a truck and has never liked Claudine from the first time he met her. I asked him if he'd like to come to dinner. He said, "About time, Frank," and showed up at my door the next evening in a decent blazer looking like he'd been waiting for this invitation his entire life. We got to the restaurant early, Calvin and I. The place was called something with kitchen in the name. White tablecloths, the kind of place where they tell you the specials like they're revealing a secret. I asked to be seated with an extra chair. I said we were expecting one more. Claudine's parents arrived first, her father, a big man named Bill with a handshake that wanted to tell you something, and her mother, quiet and watchful in the way that reminded me of Claudine. We made small talk. They were pleasant enough. They didn't know anything about the documents or the money or the house. I was sure of that. They were collateral audience, and I didn't enjoy that part, but I also didn't invent the situation. Marcus and Claudine arrived 12 minutes late. She was wearing the kind of blouse that said she'd thought about this dinner. He looked tired. She looked at Calvin, and then at me, and something shifted in her face, just slightly, just for a second, before she smiled. "Calvin," she said, like a question disguised as a greeting. "Claudine," Calvin said, like an answer. We ordered drinks. We looked at menus. Her father made a comment about Ontario winters, and I agreed with him about Ontario winters, and we were all very civilized. Then Claudine said, "Frank, have you had more time to think about our conversation?" She said it lightly, casually, like she was asking if I'd remembered to call the plumber. In front of her parents, in front of her husband, in front of my brother, in this restaurant where she'd arranged the seating and planned the evening and thought she'd arranged everything. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out 2 envelopes. The room got a specific kind of quiet. I put one envelope on the table in front of Marcus. I put the other in front of Claudine. "I've had quite a lot of time to think," I said. "I've thought about the $42,000. I've thought about the document you asked me to sign, and I've had someone help me think about some of the other things. Those are his findings." Claudine did not open the envelope. She looked at it. "Dad," Marcus said. "I'm not angry," I said. "That was the truest thing I said all night. I want you to know that. I'm not doing this out of anger. I'm doing this because I have a grandson, and I intend to be part of his life. And if there's going to be a conversation about what's fair and what this family is actually going to look like, I'd like to have it now, while everyone is here and I have witnesses." Her father cleared his throat. "What is this?" Claudine said. Her voice had a new quality to it, flatter, like something adjusting. "It's a summary of some financial activity," I said. "My lawyer has the complete file. I'm not here to threaten anyone. I'm here to let you know that I am not uninformed, I am not isolated, and I am not going to sign anything now." I picked up my menu. "I'm going to have the salmon." "Calvin, what are you having?" Calvin looked at the menu. "I think the ribeye," he said. I won't tell you the rest of the dinner was comfortable because it wasn't. Her mother excused herself to the bathroom and came back looking like she'd made a phone call. Her father was quiet in a way that was different from before. Marcus barely ate. Claudine was very controlled. I'll give her that, she was very controlled. But she didn't speak to me again, except to say goodbye at the end, and when she said goodbye, her eyes were doing something they don't usually do, which was looking for something and not finding it. What she was looking for, I think, was a version of me she'd constructed, the lonely older man, financially dependent on his son's goodwill, without resources or allies or the patience to fight. That version of Frank. She'd been working with that version for 3 years. It must have been disorienting to look across a table and find someone else. 6 weeks after the dinner, Marcus called me. Not a text, a phone call. He asked if he could come to Oakville on Sunday. He came alone. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Helen used to do crosswords, where I'd done my calculations with the yellow notepad, and Marcus talked for a long time. He talked about how things had gotten away from him. He talked about how Claudine had a way of making each thing seem small and reasonable, and how he hadn't added it up until I'd put the numbers in front of him at that dinner. He talked about how he'd been ashamed and scared, and how shame had made him quieter when he should have been louder. He cried. My son, who is 34 years old and looks exactly like his mother, sat at Helen's table and cried. I didn't tell him it was fine, because it wasn't fine. I told him I loved him, which was true, and I told him the most important thing was Eli and what kind of family Eli was going to grow up in. Marcus and Claudine are working through things. I'm not going to tell you how that resolves because I don't know yet, and it's not my story to tell. What I know is that I have Eli on Tuesday afternoons now. Marcus drops him off. We walk the waterfront trail when the weather allows. We watch whatever he wants on the television. I teach him the names of birds from the bird feeder Helen put up 20 years ago, and that I've kept filled every winter since. The house is still mine. The trust for Eli is set up, documented, managed by Beverly, untouchable. The $40,000 is the subject of an ongoing civil matter that my lawyer is handling and that I'm not going to discuss further here. I think about Helen when I sit at that kitchen table now. I think about what she would have done, and I genuinely believe this. She would have done the same things I did, just faster and with better handwriting on the notepad. I wasn't heroic. I was just paying attention, finally, instead of looking away because looking away felt kinder. There's a chair at the head of my kitchen table that's been empty for 7 years, not metaphorically, literally empty, because I eat at the side now, the way I did when Helen sat at the head because she liked to be closest to the stove. I've thought about moving to a different chair. I never do. That chair belongs to someone who built something worth protecting. I'm still here. I'm still protecting it. And every Tuesday there's a small boy who knows the difference between a chickadee and a nuthatch, who calls me Pop, who does not know yet what was done to keep him in my life. He will know. When he's ready, I'll tell him the whole story. I still have that yellow notepad. It's in the kitchen drawer, under a stack of takeout menus I never use. Sometimes I pull it out and look at the numbers, not out of bitterness, but because it reminds me of something I needed to learn the hard way, that doing nothing is also a choice, and it has consequences just like any other. For a long time I told myself that staying quiet was the kind thing to do, that not pushing back was generosity. But there's a difference between being generous and being compliant, and I confused the two for years. Every time I transferred money without asking questions, every time I didn't say what I was thinking because I didn't want to cause trouble, I wasn't being kind. I was being absent. I was handing the situation to someone else and hoping it would sort itself out. It didn't sort itself out. It got worse quietly, the way these things do when no one is paying attention. What I understand now is that what finally changed things wasn't anger. It was clarity. Beverly laying out my accounts on a spreadsheet, my lawyer reading that document over his glasses, Phil's 4-page summary, referenced and precise. None of that was emotional. All of it required me to sit down, think carefully, and do the work of understanding exactly what I was dealing with. That's not something I would have done in my 50s. I would have picked up the phone and said something I'd regret. There's something about getting older that, if you let it, teaches you that being right in the moment is worth a lot less than being effective over time. I think about Marcus at that table, not looking at me. I've had to make peace with my part in that. I made it too easy, for too long, for him to look away. I didn't ask enough of him when he was young, the specific kind of asking that says, you are responsible for what you do and what you allow. That's not blame. It's just cause and effect, the kind that plays out over decades in ways you can't always see until you're sitting across from your son in a restaurant in Oakville, watching him not eat his dinner. But I also think about that Tuesday walk with Eli, the two of us on the waterfront trail with the lake going gray in the November light, him pointing at a bird and me telling him the name. That moment exists because I didn't sign the paper, because I made the phone calls, because I respected myself enough to say, this is my home and I built it, and I am not going to hand it over because someone made the silence feel easier than the fight. Integrity isn't dramatic. That's the part nobody tells you. It's mostly just small decisions made quietly that add up over time into something you can either stand behind or you can't. I can stand behind mine. Finally.